So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We know people are really busy, but this should be a really interesting and exciting presentation. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Jen Leone. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at HPD. Next slide. As you know, this is the first of a two-part session about the HPD Solar Where Feasible mandate and our partnership with Solar One. Part two next week is going to talk much more specifically about the solar where feasible, the mandate, the process, the protocol, and the solar feasibility analysis. So you don't have to worry about that today, and save any thoughts and questions for next week on that. Today, we're going to focus much more on the 101 and talk about solar as it applies particularly in New York City and to affordable housing. Next slide. I think everybody at this point is familiar with local laws 92 and 94 requiring solar on or green roofs on all new and structural roof replacements. I think everyone also knows that most affordable housing projects have a way to waiver out due to financial infeasibility with a letter from HPD. But that's only through 2024. And we think that, next slide, the solar where feasible mandate, which I'll talk about in a minute, is a really good way to kind of scale up solar across affordable housing in the interim. You know, instead of looking at solar as something that is a burden, we really want to think about how to bring it to more people in the intervening years and figure out the best way to get solar where it makes the most sense on affordable housing and expand the reach of solar. So HPD's solar where feasible mandate is our attempt to do that. And we've embedded it into Enterprise Green. And note also that the whole solar feasibility analysis is a required component for projects certifying with LEED as well. And what is the solar where feasible mandate? It's a cost-effective solar mandate. We require solar where it makes sense and where it's financially feasible. And the way that we've been assessing that is talking about solar where it has a 10-year payback or less. That's not an exact science, but we're looking at that as a good mark of whether solar makes sense on a project. No project can go through the Enterprise Green pre-build authorization process without a signed solar approval form. So it's important to think about this early and get that piece of the process into play. And again, we'll talk about that more next week. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Noah Ginsberg and Annika Wister-Jones, our nonprofit partners at Solar One. These guys have been working with HPD for many years to bring solar to affordable housing, and we're really excited about this partnership.
Thanks so much, Jen. Hi, everyone. So my name is Noah Ginsberg. I'm the director of the Here Comes Solar program at Solar One. As Jen mentioned, we have a 3-year partnership with HPD to provide technical assistance to support the success of HPD's solar program. That support is funded by NYSERDA, and what it means is we are available to provide assistance for your solar projects. Here Comes Solar is an initiative of nonprofit Solar One. We started Here Comes Solar 6 years ago, really with the goal of expanding access to solar energy in high barrier segments of the market, affordable housing being one of those main segments. If you advance the slide, it'll unhide what our services are. So we do, for existing buildings, we do on-site assessment, we do preliminary solar design, we consult with owners and development teams like yourself to figure out the best way to finance and structure your project. We provide procurement assistance, so helping to solicit bids from qualified contractors, and we provide project implementation support as well. For this, the next part of the session, Annika Wister-Jones is going to give an overview of solar technology before we dive into economics and considerations for development teams.
Hi, everyone. And I want to start with a little bit of the basics of how solar photovoltaic energy works. So first of all, energy from the sun comes to solar panels and is converted into electricity. I'm sure everyone knows that by now. That energy goes through wires into the electrical room of the building, where usually there's a box called an inverter, which converts the power from DC energy, which is how it's created, to AC energy, which is what we use in the buildings. And then it's used by usually the common meter of the building. And anything that isn't used immediately at that moment is sent out to the grid, to the utility, and you get a credit for all of the kilowatt hours that you send out to the grid that you can use later. So often what happens is during the day, you produce a ton of energy because the sun is shining, but most of your lights aren't on. And then you send that energy to the grid, and then you buy it back for reducing your bill at night when the sun is down and you've turned on all your lights and started using more electricity. So over time, over the day, there's a lot of production and then a lot of usage, and it averages out to a certain amount of offset on your bill. A little basics on the actual technology of solar panels. Solar panels are incredibly durable. They have a warranty of 25 years, so they last at least that long, often longer. One thing that means is that it's best on new roofs. So this, including solar as part of new construction, can be really beneficial, both for the roof and for the solar panels. They are very low maintenance. There's no moving parts. They have very long warranties, and you can monitor them either online or with an app on your phone. And so there's really nothing that you need to do for consistent annual maintenance. We often recommend that someone looks at the panels maybe once a year to make sure that no debris has blown up on them or anything's gotten dislodged. But other than that, there's really no maintenance required. They do, however, require direct sunlight. So that's shade from other buildings or roof obstructions like elevator bulkheads or chimneys. So we need to put solar panels in places where they're unshaded. And they are, as I said before, grid connected. So that's great. It allows you to do that, sending energy to the grid and then using it later on. But it also means that the solar panels do not provide backup power in a blackout unless you've installed batteries. And I should note that currently in New York City, battery energy storage is very difficult and very expensive, and we usually don't recommend it. There are three types of solar installations on flat roofs in New York City. They're all great solutions, and they are each good for different situations. With proper workmanship, each one of these will allow the roof's integrity and warranty to be preserved after a solar installation. So the first one, and probably the most common, is a ballasted array. So this is a system that is weighed down with cinder blocks, basically, and there's no roof penetrations at all. So that makes it very straightforward and easy to install. And it is usually best for roofs that have a lot of space, because you can see there's spaces in between the rows of the panels. I should also note that this only works if the building is below 100 feet, because the wind load for higher buildings mean that ballasted installations aren't code compliant. The next option is a mechanically attached planar array. So this is similar, but in this case, there's a structure to the roof that, to the solar panels, that attaches to the roof structure itself. And with this, you can see the panels are closer together. You can fit more solar production in a smaller area, but it is more complex to design, more materials, and so it's a little bit more expensive. This is better for space-constrained roofs and taller roofs. Then the third option is a canopy array, which is similar to the mechanically attached planar array, but it's raised 9 feet in the air. So the benefits of this is that it can go over other uses for the roof. So if you have mechanical equipment on the roof, the solar canopy can be lifted above that, but it also works really well above resident terraces or as a shade structure for common spaces on the roof. Many buildings decide to do that as well. This is maybe not surprisingly the most expensive option, but in many cases it can be worth it for the co-benefits. There are a couple different options for how to distribute the solar energy or the solar credits. The most common is to use the energy just to offset the common area usage of a building. So lights, laundry rooms, elevators, that sort of thing. It's also possible, however, to split the power between the residential units and also the common area with what's called community shared solar. This only works if the building's roof is big enough to hold that type of capacity, but it can increase the benefits from solar and provide benefits to residents as well. So if that's something that you're interested, we can help you explore your options for that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that owner-paid electrical needs might change as you do different upgrades to the building. So if you're putting in efficiency measures, that might reduce the amount that you budget for the energy, or if you're doing electrification measures like heat pumps, that could increase it. Now is our time for questions on the basics of solar technology. I think we have a few questions, but please feel free to write more. First question is, what do we mean by mechanically integrated? So I'll just go back and show that. If you look here, you can see there are places where the racking of the solar system penetrates the roof and then is attached to the substructure, the structure of the roof itself, compared to the ballasted design where it just sits on top of the roof. So it's integrated into the structure of the roof mechanically. That's what that means. And then another question is, after snowstorms, does one attempt to remove the snow that's on top of the panels, or do you have to wait until the snow melts naturally before the solar panels are operating efficiently again? You can, if you want to, remove the snow, but we don't recommend it because if you think about it, solar panels are black and glass, and they're usually tilted. So the snow will most often just slide right off all on its own. And moreover, the times that you get snow in the winter are the times when you're producing the least energy. So if you lose a day of energy production in December or January, you're really not losing that much. It doesn't actually affect your overall yearly production. And so it's not worth the effort of cleaning off the snow. It's possible, but not recommended. And I think we can move on from here. We'll have another space for questions at the end of the next section. Oh, here's another question in the chat that's very easy to answer. The process for submitting to Solar One is to email affordable@solarone.org, and we'll have that later on. Oh, Noah just put it in the chat. So it's very easy. Okay, now Noah will talk about the solar economics and considerations for financials.
Great, thank you, Annika. For the section on solar economics, we're going to start by focusing on the cost side of solar, and then we'll get into the ways that you save money with solar. So first, just a note about almost vocabulary or ways that folks talk about solar costs in the industry. Solar is typically presented in dollars per watt DC of capacity. A watt is a unit of electrical power. If you think about a 60-watt light bulb, that's in the context of energy consumption. Solar panels are also rated in watts, and that's their instantaneous power output potential in full sun. A typical solar panel is 300 to 400 watts. But this dollar per watt metric is really valuable because it allows you to look at multiple proposals and understand the dollar per watt you can kind of it helps you level bids. While equipment costs have declined a lot over the last decade, New York does still have high soft costs. So that's something to keep in mind. And these are some major drivers of cost listed on the screen here. So price per watt will be higher for smaller systems because you've got fixed costs in terms of permitting and construction mobilization and all that to spread out over a smaller project. Price per watt will be higher for mechanically attached systems just because there are greater material and labor costs associated. Taller buildings are typically more expensive to install solar on for a few reasons. There's the bringing the electric power you generate on the roof down to the electric room. If you didn't make your building solar ready and include that conduit from the start, there's an expense there. Plus, there's more engineering associated with putting solar on high-rise buildings. Prevailing wage requirements will increase the cost of a solar project significantly. Typically, we see something like 20% price premium on the overall cost of an installation if it's prevailing wage. And then, as Annika mentioned, canopy design and other kind of creative design elements that are more architectural in nature will also increase cost per watt. Cost per watt will come down for larger systems, for ballasted installations, which again is more common on low-rise, mid-rise buildings. And then also if you utilize competitive procurement, and if you're able to bundle multiple projects together when you go out to bid, that will also drive down cost per watt. Next slide. This is just a view of average costs for projects in New York City. You can see that price per watt decreases as project size increases. The unit KW stands for kilowatt. It's 1,000 watts. A typical multifamily installation, it really does depend on the size of the building, but we've got a couple examples at the bottom of the screen here. Example, multifamily pricing. This is before any incentives are applied. So for an 8 kilowatt mechanically attached system, this is really what you'd expect to see on a relatively small walk-up building, almost the size of a private residence. A project like that might be $5 a watt, $40,000 turnkey. And then more kind of typical larger multifamily projects, 30, 40 kilowatts, you might have a price tag of about $100,000 for a ballasted array. And for a canopy, you could get more solar onto that same roof, but your price per watt will be quite a bit higher because you have that steel or aluminum superstructure to elevate the array in the air. So next, we're going to talk about ways that solar saves you money. The first is intuitive. If you generate solar power on your rooftop, that's going to directly reduce your utility expenses. Rooftop solar is really reliable. The energy savings that are projected are, solar is a very bankable investment. There have been studies done by NYSERDA, the state's energy authority, has looked at energy yield versus estimated energy yield for solar projects all across the state. And actual over estimated is about 99%. So very reliable production and reliable savings. The savings do depend on the system output. So high performance is important. A well-designed system will generate more savings. And another thing to keep in mind is that your utility bill savings will depend on your electric rate that you're on with Con Edison. And there are ways to change your metering configuration to maximize the value of solar energy, which if you reach out for a consultation for your building, we're happy to talk through with you in detail. The next way that you save money with solar is through rebates and tax incentives. In New York City, solar projects are heavily subsidized. Incentives can offset more than half the cost of a system. The first incentive to keep in mind, which is applicable across all affordable housing, is the NYSERDA New York Sun incentive. This incentive is $1 per watt, which can offset, in some cases, up to a third of the cost of an installation. So that's a significant incentive that is typically paid directly to the solar installer. It can also be assigned to the owner. There are a couple ways to handle that, but that's a significant incentive that reduces the funds required for a solar project. $1 per watt is a really generous incentive for a non-affordable housing project, a normal multifamily project. The incentive right now is 30 cents per watt. So significant additional incentive for affordable housing because it's a priority for the state. There's a federal tax credit for solar. That federal tax credit is 26% right now. Congress actually just extended it at 26% for another 2 years. And then it's scheduled to step down over time. There are ways to qualify for the 26% tax credit, even if your project is going to be built a little bit later, which we'll talk about in later slides. There's a state tax credit, which is really only relevant for owner-occupied projects, so co-ops and condos. And then solar is also eligible for 100% bonus depreciation, as well as a property tax abatement. So if we combine those two things together, between the utility bill savings and the incentives, a typical multifamily solar project in New York City is going to have a payback of anywhere from 5 to 12 years before you break even, recoup your investment, and then you're going to have those utility bill savings for years to come. This is a side-by-side of these two example projects. And you can see this project with tax incentives, you're looking at like a 5-6 year payback. Even if that same project did not claim any of the solar tax incentives, I would have a 12 or 13 year payback. So it still pays for itself, just over a longer period of time. These are just solar incentives, but if in the context of multifamily affordable housing, if you combine solar with low-income housing tax credits, that's a really powerful combination. The return you're going to get on a combined solar with low-income housing tax credit project is really compelling. There are some interactions between those two incentives. If you take both the solar tax credit as well as the low-income housing tax credit, it reduces the portion of your solar that you can that goes into the eligible basis for the low-income housing tax credit, decreases by half the value of your solar tax credit. But again, you're looking at really quick paybacks on these projects. The next slide is just a breakdown kind of in table view, which is helpful for some folks just to think about these projects with real numbers. Again, just an example project, but if you look at the upfront cost and the annual bill savings, it would look like something like a 13 or 14 year payback without incentives. But with low-income housing tax credits and the federal tax credit, you can see that your break even is closer to year 7. I'm going to go through one quick case study before we open it up for Q&A. So this is Arthur Avenue Apartments. This is a new construction project. The developer was Foxy Management. The GC was Lend Lease. We facilitated procurement for this project in February of last year. This is a little bit different in that this was post-closing that they decided to add solar to scope. They were planning on a green roof. For a variety of reasons, they were not able to integrate the green roof, so they had some funds available and had roof space. And so they were able to find a great solar installation partner, Accord Power, to build a 70 kilowatt solar canopy for $4.15 per watt on that project. And that system is estimated to have a payback period of 7 years. The project was completed in the summer. You jump to the next slide, you can see the project economics. We don't have time during this session to dive into the solar screening tool, but the numbers that you're looking at right now are the output of the solar screening tool for this project. And then next, we've got a nice photo of that solar canopy. You can see there's still some scaffolding underneath there because they were doing work when they took this photo, but a nice installation. And with that, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. It looks like a couple of questions have come in. The first that I'm seeing here, is there any data on installation quality and issues with prevailing wage versus projects that did not use it? That's an interesting question. Not that I'm aware of. For whatever it's worth, the solar industry is largely not non-union, and the solar industry is highly regulated. I mean, if you just think about the NYSERDA has their own quality assurance, quality control program where they're doing site audits and inspections on 1 in 7 solar projects that receive their incentive. And so they're tracking the quality of all of the contractors that are approved through their program. And then that's on top of course, all of the normal Con Edison and Department of Buildings inspections. But I don't believe there's a lot of data on that, but it's an interesting question. Look at other questions here. Do the upfront costs in the Arthur Avenue project include soft costs? That's a great question. Yes, that was the turnkey cost. The solar industry, again, is largely design build. So that's a project where Accord Power, the selected contractor, did the design, the engineering, all the permitting, construction, inspections, you name it, as part of that project. Are there special considerations for use on landmark buildings? Yes, if you're putting solar on a landmark building, it needs to be minimally visible. And you need to get approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. If it's minimally visible, that can be done at the staff level without a community board presentation. It's something that solar installers have experience navigating. I think there
we have some questions in the chat as well. Looks like we've got some more questions coming in here too. But in the chat, one of the questions is, how does Solar One relate to green communities consultants like Stephen Winter or Bright Power? Are they competitors or collaborators?
That's a great question. Our goal is to be collaborators. We're available to provide support and consultation, and we will provide that consultation directly to development teams, and that can mean different things for different projects. In some cases, we'll work directly with an owner or an architect. In other cases, we'll work with a consultant. The intent behind the NYSERDA funded technical assistance to support the Solar Where Feasible program is to be additive, not duplicative. So if there are projects that where it's a high capacity team that has done 1 million solar projects and really knows what they're doing, they've already got a consultant on board, Solar One's not going to play a large role on those projects. If there is a project where a team needs support, we're available and happy to provide it.
Great. And then we got a question from Bud Heileman on the typical payback period for where a system will cover its cost. Bud, can you just let us know if we've already answered that in Noah's part of the presentation? If not, we can go into more detail. Another question that we got was a question about zoning. In many affordable housing projects, they're maximizing the zoning envelope to provide the most affordable housing. They run into height restrictions. And so the question is whether the feasibility assessment takes zoning into account.
The short answer is the feasibility assessment should take zoning into account. If you've already reached max height capacity, you can still put solar on that roof, and it's a permitted obstruction for up to 4 feet off the roof deck. However, you do need to leave fire access pathways on that rooftop if it's less than 100 feet. But yeah, that's absolutely a piece of it. The solar screening tool that we're going to cover in depth on Tuesday is really about the economics of a project, but you still need to look at the technical feasibility of solar for your project, which is something that you need to take into account all of the code and the zoning and all that.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that the issue of maximum height really only, solar only interacts with that when it's a canopy system, because any more standard system is below 4 feet. So it's only an issue with a canopy system, and in that case, you can usually create a canopy that's 25% of the roof coverage. So it's not usually an issue, but it is good to keep in mind.
Another question came in about the NYSERDA incentive. A great question. Has that dollar per watt incentive been pretty constant over the past few years? Important to consider because project timelines are slow and can take some time. So the NYSERDA incentive is $1 per watt through the end of the program. So that's at least for the next 3 years. That's true for affordable housing. It's not true for market rate projects. Market rate projects, the incentive steps down over time, but NYSERDA is basically designed that incentive to stay at $1 per watt. For the tax credits, those step down over time. However, there are ways to secure a higher tax incentive for your project, even if construction is going to start a little bit later, that we're going to get into later in this presentation. Another question was a clarification on what happens if you are not able to get a staff level approval by the Landmark Preservation Commission for a project. So if you have a project where it's not minimally visible as determined by the LPC staff, then there would be a community board hearing that's required, where basically it's just the next level of scrutiny. You have to do a public hearing and make a case for why your solar project should be allowed, even though it, at least according to staff, is not minimally visible.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Noah. There's 2 more questions here.
Great. Who would determine the available space for solar? Let's say there are mechanicals on the roof. How do we know which type of solar array would be most appropriate? That's a great question. So if you're working with an architecture firm or sustainability consultant that really understands solar, they should be able to assist with that. If you need support, Solar One is available to provide support and assist with that as well.
And then Noah, did you already answer the question about combined use of vegetated roof below canopies, and I just missed it?
I don't think I answered that one.
Okay, I can answer that. It is possible to use canopies with a green roof below. We're actually working on a project like that currently with a retrofit project. But the only things to keep in mind is that you want to create a system where the solar panels let in more light in between the panels, and also you want to use vegetation that doesn't require full direct sunlight, so that it can be shaded slightly. But there's no reason that shouldn't work, and it's often a very good combination to have solar and green roofs at the same time. The next follow-up question to that is if there's a method of determining solar versus green roof viability. That's very hard to determine because they address different issues. Solar is usually a financial payback decision, whereas green roofs address water conservation and habitat, and they just look very nice. So I wouldn't say that there's a specific ratio that you can use. It's a decision of preference. Okay, I think we can move on now. We'll have another section of questions after this next part of the presentation. So this part is considerations specifically for development teams when including solar in the project. So I first want to ground ourselves in the enterprise green process and where solar fits into that. So the top line here is a fairly high level version of the enterprise green process. You have builds intake, and sometime at builds review or sometime before pre-build, you're required to do the solar feasibility analysis. As Jen said, that's required for pre-build authorization. And that means that you're taking a look at solar as early as possible in the process, so that, as we've said before, you can take that into account in making other decisions. Then there's lots of other things that happen, I'm sure, but at some point between 3 and 6 months before closing, we recommend that you procure a solar contractor and solicit multiple bids. Solar One can help with that competitive procurement, or you can do it on your own. Either way, you should have a solar installer selected prior to the project closing and then project conversion. And to take a closer look at that, if we're looking at the solar timeline itself, you select a contractor, and then the loan closes and contracts are signed. But one thing to note here is that if permits are required prior to loan closing, then the solar design and permitting costs must be included in pre-development financing. So you would take these 2 boxes and put them and pay for them before the project loan closing. If not, then it's better to do it afterwards, obviously out of the loan funds. Then the building is constructed, and I want to note that at the point of the solar system installation, you should coordinate the solar installation with the roofing installation to make sure that the roofer and the solar installer are on the same page, and you can ensure that the roof warranty is preserved throughout the solar installation. And then the solar installation is inspected and commissioned, and I'm sure the rest of the building is as well. Let's go over some of the things to keep in mind when we're looking at whether a building is a good candidate for solar or not. We've talked about some of these already. Some of these are things that you're in control of as a developer and some aren't, but it's always good to know what they are and have a sense before you get started of what will be a good candidate. So some things that you probably don't have control over are things like the height of the building. Lower buildings are easier to get materials up onto, and whether you have eligibility for tax credits, as Noah talked about before. Some things that you do have control over often are the design of the system, whether it's ballasted versus mechanically attached or a canopy. Whether there's a large available roof area. As you can see in this building, there's plenty of space for those solar panels, and whether the building is solar ready. And you can see that in this example screening tool, which has all of those elements and will pay for itself in about 4 years. Unfavorable elements, again, some of them are things in your control and some of them aren't. So again, the height of the building and the eligibility for tax credits, probably not something that you can control, although I should note that there are creative ways for nonprofits to be able to take advantage of some of the tax credits using third-party ownership. That's something that we can work with you if you want to go into more depth, but by and large, I wouldn't assume that. Things that you can control are the available roof area and the cost of the installation. So even if you have a good roof for solar, if the cost of the installation is very high, then that can make the payback period much longer and make it unfeasible as a financial consideration. So again, we recommend getting multiple bids for any given project. Looking at this roof, this is a building that is not great for solar, and a couple of the reasons are that they have a water tower in the southern portion of the roof, which means that this would shade a significant area of the roof to the north of it. The roof is also designed in a way that has very little continuous space, and what space there is has a lot of mechanical equipment, vents, maybe even skylights. It's a little hard to tell from this picture. And so there's very little area for a solar system to fit in with all of these other things that are on the roof already. So if you can avoid that, then that makes it better. And one thing I want to note is that no single element would make a roof unfeasible for solar. But if you have a combination of all of these factors, then we would not advise it. And that's one of the reasons why the solar where feasible mandate is, we think, so beneficial, because it doesn't require solar when it just really doesn't make sense. So let's talk about solar ready designs. This is something where you can make a roof better for solar and increase your return on investment and the benefits to the building and the residents. Some simple things that you can do in the design and construction phase that really significantly improve the cost of solar without actually changing the price of construction are things like running conduit to the roof during construction. That's often a very expensive part of the solar installation costs, but if it's already included in the building, then the solar installer doesn't have to price it separately. Expanding the public service panel where the solar will be interconnected to make sure that it's the right size. If it's too small, the solar installer might need to replace it, which would be kind of a waste if you've just built a new building. And consolidating mechanical equipment on the roof so that it's all in one place and you can leave plenty of space for solar in other places. So you can see this building has all of their mechanical equipment all in one place, and just to the north of the bulkhead that would shade this area for solar anyway. So there's plenty of room here to the south and room farther to the north where that shade wouldn't extend, that would be totally fine for a solar array. If you're thinking really hard about solar at the very beginning of your project, you can also consider things like locating the bulkhead to the north portion of a building, or building it in a way that there's a lot of contiguous space for solar, and as well as all of the other simple elements. But these simple elements can happen, up until construction, basically. Now I'll turn things over to Noah to talk about some other considerations for solar.
Great, thanks, Annika. So another thing to consider with your solar project is the contracting structure. So most typically with affordable housing development, you've got a GC and then a number of subcontractors working underneath them. That certainly is a way that you can do solar. It's one of the common ways. However, solar companies are design build firms. They're accustomed to, solar is typically an Alt-2 with the DOB. It's something that they are capable of handling independently and do on many projects, working directly with the building owner or the developer. So, this is kind of a question. Do you have your solar company fold under the GC, so you've got a single prime, or do you have two prime contracts? So the benefits of having a single prime is, of course, it keeps things simple. You're only working with your GC. There's only one party requisitioning funds from HPD. There's streamlined coordination among the subcontractors. So your GC will tell your roofer when to get in and get out, and tell the solar company when to get in and get out, and make sure that things go smoothly. Really the only significant drawback of having the solar company come in under the GC is, of course, the GC is going to charge a markup on the turnkey services provided by your solar company for their work, doing all of that coordination, bonding the job, etc. We've worked on projects both ways. The major benefit of having multiple prime contracts is that it will lower the overall cost of your solar project because you're avoiding the GC markup on the solar. There are a lot of drawbacks though. So you have more contractors to manage. You have to ensure that there's coordination happening between the GC and your solar contractor. And then another issue that we've encountered over the years is that for solar companies that have not had extensive experience working with HPD, they're not necessarily familiar with the process of requisitioning funds and all of the other kind of administrative work that's involved in being a prime contractor on a New York City affordable housing project. Our general recommendation is going with the single prime model, having solar function like the other trades where it folds in under the GC. However, there are cases where it could be justified to have a direct contract with the solar company. So this next consideration, this is a really important one, is finding the right solar installer for your project. So there are kind of three buckets that we recommend considering with contractor selection. Those being the firm's qualifications, the quality of the proposal they put forward, and then their pricing, and along with that, kind of their interview and more the interpersonal elements of it. These are in this order for a reason. It's easy to focus on price. Price is obviously important. Budgets are tight. You want a cost-effective job, but you also want to make sure you're working with a contractor that's going to deliver a high-performing system and work well with your GC and the other trades. On the qualification side, obviously your normal things like insurance and licensure. You also want to look at NYSERDA approval. If you're not working with a NYSERDA approved solar company, you're not going to be able to secure the NYSERDA incentive, which can cover 20–30% of your project costs. So that's important. We recommend looking at corporate track record and longevity. There are some newer solar installation companies that do great work, but what we would recommend looking at with them is the experience of their principals, how much New York City specific experience they have, and then also how much multifamily experience they have. As you all know, doing construction in New York City is like nowhere else on earth. So just because someone is great at building solar projects in New Jersey or Westchester doesn't mean that they know how to get a permit at the DOB. So those were things that we'd recommend looking at. When actually looking at proposals, we recommend looking closely at their solar design, making sure that it was a thoughtful design that took into consideration where other equipment is going to go, making sure that there's sufficient access around HVAC equipment for maintenance, all that kind of stuff. Looking at the equipment that they're speccing and the warranties associated. Solar panels typically come with a 25-year warranty. Inverters, it can range really from anywhere from 5 to 20 years. So you want to look closely at that along with the workmanship warranty. And then the implementation plan. When we run RFPs on behalf of clients, we always request that the respondent put forward an implementation plan. And you want to make sure that they put thought into it, and it really it lines up and instills confidence. And then pricing, obviously very important. But in addition to pricing, we recommend doing an interview with contractors and checking references. If we had to boil it down to 3 recommendations on contractor selection, secure multiple bids and compare them to keep things competitive and make sure you're getting the most value. Interview your contractors prior to selection to make sure that there's good rapport between you and that contractor. You think they're going to work well with your development team, and resist the temptation to go with the lowest price bid. In many cases, the lowest price bid is the best one, but in some cases, you're going to get more long-term value by paying slightly more for a high-performing system. Okay, another consideration is maximizing tax incentives. With this slide, I'll start with the note at the bottom, which is that we're not accountants. We don't provide tax advice. You should speak with your tax professional about eligibility for incentives. However, these are 2 strategies that we're aware of that have been used successfully to increase the value of solar tax credits. So the first is a concept called safe harboring. The solar tax credit does step down over time. For projects that qualify this year or next year, the tax credit is 26%, and then it starts stepping down. You can qualify next year for that tax credit, even if your project is not going to be fully constructed next year. That's through a process called safe harboring. If you purchase a portion of the solar equipment before that deadline, then that could make you eligible for that higher rate of the solar tax credit. Most typically, that's done by purchasing solar panels and actually taking delivery of solar panels during that year that you're hoping to qualify. Either you can actually take physical delivery of them at the construction site or at your operation center, or you can have your solar installation company do that on your behalf. And solar installation companies, if you tell them that you want to safe harbor the solar equipment, they'll know what you mean. This is a relatively common practice in the industry for commercial and multifamily projects. Another thing to consider is maximizing the basis for the solar tax credit. There are a couple different interpretations of what the basis should be for that, what you multiply 26% by. There are a couple different ways to determine the basis. The simplest way is looking at the cost of the system, then multiplying that by 26% to get your tax credit value. The NYSERDA incentive, that dollar per watt, it depending on your interpretation, that could reduce the basis of the tax credit. There are some developers that rather than reducing the basis of the tax credit, what they do is they actually treat the NYSERDA incentive as taxable income, and they do an assignment of the incentive so that it's passed directly through to the development and treated as revenue. Happy to chat more about these items with your development teams. And I believe those are the main considerations. So Annika's going to wrap things up, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A.
Great. Yeah, so in conclusion, a couple of things that we want you to take away from this presentation. First of all, the solar where feasible policy is win-win because it only requires projects to incorporate solar when it's truly beneficial for the building. The early bird catches the worm. So the earlier you think about solar when you're doing the design, the better for the solar design and for the rest of the building and for the costs. Solar ready buildings can significantly lower your costs on every level. solar can be optimized. So you can maximize savings and your return on investment by optimizing both the solar design and making sure that you can maximize the incentives as well, as Noah was just talking about. And we recommend that you try to find co-benefits. So solar canopies can provide shade for tenant accessible spaces or for HVAC systems, or as we were just talking, for green roofs. And maximizing the solar production can defray the cost of electrification. So if you're doing heat pumps or other types of electrification, adding more solar production can reduce the high electricity costs in New York City. And we really want to make it clear and easy that solar technical assistance is available to anyone. So we at Solar One can provide free consultation and procurement assistance for any HPD project at any stage of the process. And the HPD solar screening tool is very simple and designed for non-solar professionals. So anyone should be able to fill it out and get good information. And you can learn more about that on next Tuesday's presentation about the solar feasibility analysis and screening tool. So let's open it up for more questions, and we'll put these links in the chat as well for signing up for the next workshop, more information on the solar feasibility tool webpage, and our email as well.
Great. So we have a question that came in. What about mixed use projects? What, if any, issues need to be considered in terms of the ratio to commercial to residential units? That's an interesting question. A solar project, you know, it could be treated as a fully commercial solar project. I think if you have a commercial tenant on the ground floor, that's one thing. If the developer is building a project and trying to claim the tax credits, you know, then they would likely be able to do that if there's a tax credit syndicator on the deal. The short answer, David, is that it depends. For a co-op building where there are some commercial, there's a sponsor, for example, that's a partial owner that does come into play, and it can get kind of complicated, but happy to chat about that offline. There's another question here. Have you seen a roof master lease or other model used in New York City that allow the cost of solar to be covered outside of the building financing? Absolutely. That's a relatively common way to finance solar on rooftops in New York City and around the country through a lease or a power purchase agreement. There are cases where that's going to make sense, certainly on existing buildings that are not in the process of being financed. Looking at a power purchase agreement or a lease is a great option. And I think in the context of new construction, the simplest thing is to include it in the project budget. Of course, if it was pushed out, then looking at third-party financing would be a good plan B. Another question came in. Is there a list of pre-qualified solar contractors available through NYSERDA or HPD? Yeah, NYSERDA does have a list of all of their approved contractors. It's an exhaustive list. It's everyone in the state. But it's also public information which companies, basically there's a public database with every solar project that received the NYSERDA incentive. And so you can see which companies have experience in New York City. That would be a good way to narrow down the list. We're certainly happy to help with that. Let's see. Annika, do you want to jump in and take some of these questions?
Sure. I can answer Bud's question about the typical life cycle of a solar panel before loss of efficiency or replacement. So solar panels actually degrade a very small amount every year. It's like 0.2 to 0.5% per year, which means that at year 25, their warranty is that they'll be producing, usually it's 85 to 90% of what they're producing on year one. So it's a slow, very, very slow decline, which means that at year 25, you could replace it, but it's still producing the vast majority of energy that it was producing at the beginning. So we would recommend replacing the panels after they've really significantly reduced their production. So many years later. And we did have a question about sending the slides. I've typed this in the chat, but I want to say we'll be sending these slides to everyone who attended. We're also recording the presentation, and we'll make that recording available shortly. So we have a couple more minutes. If there are any other questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, well, we see one final question came in. Will you be sharing the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, absolutely. We're going to be circulating it to everybody who registered. Just want to thank you all for your attendance today and for engaging on this really important topic of getting solar onto multifamily affordable housing. We hope that you found this useful, and we very strongly encourage you to come back on Tuesday at 12 o'clock for the second part of this series, which focuses really on the solar screening tool and HPD solar approval process. Thanks so much.
Thank you.